4 times. 1 liter in 10 came from Chinese suppliers in 2024. The 2026 target is 4 in 10, a 4-fold shift in the domestic share of the light-sensitive chemical that patterns every chip made inside China, all while the foreign supply of that same chemistry was placed under export control. In July 2023, Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry extended licensing requirements to 12 categories of core semiconductor materials, including the specific photoresist chemistries that pattern the most advanced nodes, and named 42 Chinese entities in the controlled perimeter. The metric is domestic photoresist self-sufficiency, the percentage of the light-sensitive chemical consumed inside China that originates from Chinese producers. That number was roughly 10% in 2024. The stated target for 2026 is 40%. What moved it and what the movement leaves uncovered is what the rest of this reading documents. Photoresist is the chemical applied to a silicon wafer before each patterning step in chip manufacturing. Ultraviolet light exposes it through a mask. The exposed regions are chemically developed away, and the remaining resist protects the underlying material while the chip's features are etched into it. Every wafer run consumes a measurable volume of resist. The chemical is not retained or recycled. This makes photoresist a consumable, and consumables behave differently than capital equipment under an embargo. A photolithography scanner is a capital asset that depreciates over a decade and can be stockpiled in quantity before control takes effect. Resist cannot be stockpiled indefinitely because its shelf life is limited and the chemistry degrades. Think of the scanner as the oven and the resist as the coating on a baking sheet. You can own the oven outright, maintain dozens of them, and still produce nothing if the coating runs out. An embargo on a consumable is, in practical terms, a production rate dial. It does not confiscate the equipment sitting in the clean room, it simply limits how many times that equipment can be operated before the line stalls. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry applied this logic in July 2023 when it extended export licensing to 12 categories of semiconductor manufacturing materials. The targeted chemistries included argon fluoride immersion resist and extreme ultraviolet resist, the 2 photoresist grades used to pattern the most critical features on advanced logic and memory chips. Prior to that extension, Japan's dominant suppliers, including the firms that collectively account for the bulk of advanced photoresist globally, had continued to ship to Chinese customers even as controls tightened around semiconductor equipment. The July 2023 action closed that gap. By 2024, the entity list had reached 42 named Chinese firms, covering the specific procurement channels through which Chinese foundries had been replenishing their resist inventory. The controlled perimeter expanded from 0 named entities on the material side to 42, and from no material-specific licensing requirements to a list explicitly targeting the chemistries that pattern sub-28 nanometer features, 0 to 42. The coverage went from none to comprehensive on the grades that matter most. In 2024, with that control regime in place, domestic photoresist self-sufficiency inside China measured at roughly 10% by volume across all grades. 9 of every 10 liters consumed by Chinese fabs arrived from abroad, primarily from Japanese suppliers, with German and Belgian producers covering much of the remainder for extreme ultraviolet grades. The 10% figure is an analyst and industry estimate, not an audited shipment result, but it is reported consistently enough across semiconductor industry coverage to treat as a reliable order of magnitude reading. 10%. 9/10 of a critical consumable sourced from the same country whose ministry had just placed it under licensing control. The stated policy target for 2026 is 40% domestic self-sufficiency. That figure appears in Chinese industrial policy reporting and semiconductor industry coverage as the objective against which domestic producers and state-backed investment are calibrated. 40%, 4 in 10 liters sourced from Chinese producers rather than from controlled foreign suppliers. The delta between these two readings is a 4-fold increase in the domestic share over approximately 2 years, 10% to 40%, 4 times. The first interpretation worth stating plainly: the 10 to 40 move is not primarily a technology achievement story, it is a procurement emergency response. The 10% domestic share was tolerated for years because Japanese and European resist was available, consistently high quality, and competitively priced. There was no commercial logic to duplicating a working supply chain at great expense when the existing one functioned reliably. The moment that supply was restricted, the domestic share became a survival metric rather than an industrial policy aspiration. The export controls converted the target from optional to load-bearing, Without the restriction, the 10% figure would have drifted upward slowly, if at all, pressured only by the ordinary pace of domestic capacity investment. With the restriction, the number acquired a deadline and a consequence: qualified domestic resist for advanced node production or reduced wafer output. China's semiconductor fabs collectively consume photoresist in volumes measured in tens of thousands of liters per year across all grades. At 10% domestic supply, the volume coming from Chinese producers filled a small fraction of that demand. The rest arrived in sealed drums on freight routes from Osaka and Frankfurt. Reaching 40% means Chinese producers would need to supply a volume that, by industry estimates, requires multiple new production facilities running at full qualification yield on the relevant chemistries. The number is not abstract. It is a specific mass of specialty chemical that either ships from a plant inside China or does not ship at all. The second interpretation: photoresist is a choke point hiding inside a choke point. Most semiconductor supply chain coverage concentrates on equipment: the scanner, the etch tool, the deposition chamber. These are visible, expensive, and their export is the subject of the most prominent control regimes. But a fab that has secured its tools and cannot secure its consumables is still a fab that cannot run. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry understood this. The July 2023 extension to materials was aimed precisely at the gap between equipment controls, which had been tightening for years, and materials controls, which had not kept pace. Restricting resist is, in practice, a restriction on wafer output volume without touching any of the capital equipment the fab already owns. The controls were calibrated to reach inside the cleanroom through the supply chain for the chemical the equipment requires to function. Domestic Chinese photoresist production in 2024 was concentrated in older chemistries, the grades used for mature nodes above 28 nanometers, where the exposure wavelength is longer and the purity tolerances are less demanding. Chinese producers have made these competently for years. The domestic capability frontier for the more demanding chemistries is a different matter. Companies including Shenzhen Electronic Materials and Rongda Photosensitive Science and Technology have reported development stage argon fluoride dry resist, and qualification work on extreme ultraviolet resist grades is described as underway. These are company claims reported in Chinese semiconductor trade press, not independently verified production data. The distinction matters. Reporting development stage work and reporting high-volume production at wafer-level yield are two different measurements. The gap between lab qualification and the yield requirements of high-volume manufacturing is where most advanced material development programs encounter their hardest constraint: development stage to production volume. That is the frontier the 40% target requires crossing. The global supply structure for advanced photoresist has not changed. The same firms that dominated before July 2023 dominate now outside China's borders. What changed is China's access to that supply. The delta in domestic self-sufficiency is not China winning market share in a normal competitive sense. It is China constructing a parallel supply infrastructure because the original supply was cut. The 40% target is not a commercial ambition aimed at displacing established suppliers in open markets. It is the minimum threshold estimated to keep Chinese fabs running if the current controls are sustained, and the calculation changes if the controls are widened. State funding, talent recruitment concentrated from overseas graduates returning under incentive programs, and forced qualification by domestic fabs, which now lack the practical option of foreign alternatives, have compressed the development timeline for domestic resist. Chinese foundries that previously had no commercial reason to accept the qualification risk of domestic chemistries now face a binary: qualify the domestic option or reduce wafer starts. That pressure is the accelerant. Whether the compression it creates survives contact with the yield requirements of high-volume manufacturing on argon fluoride immersion and extreme ultraviolet grades is the critical unknown sitting inside the 40% target. The third interpretation, the fourfold target, tells you more about where the ceiling was than about where the floor is. A country that covered 90% of its own resist demand would not announce 40% as a milestone. The announcement itself confirms that even after years of stated domestic substitution policy and multiple industrial funding rounds explicitly targeting semiconductor materials, the dependency remained nearly total as recently as 2024. The delta from 10% to 40% is large in proportional terms. In absolute terms, 6 of every 10 liters of resist still need to come from somewhere, and the hardest chemistries remain far from covered by domestic production at verified yield. The announcement calibrates the ambition. It does not describe the outcome. 3 reasons the instrument could be reading a partial signal. The first, the 40% figure, is a stated policy objective. not a reported shipment result. Industrial policy targets in semiconductor self-sufficiency have historically been announced before the manufacturing base to support them exists. The target could be met on paper through redefined measurement, counting resists produced at below specification yield, or counting volume produced but not yet qualified for leading-edge nodes without reflecting genuine substitution of the controlled chemistries at the grades that matter. Until verifiable trade data or an independent audit confirms that 40% of consumed resist volume originates domestically and passes wafer-level qualification on advanced node processes, the number is a trajectory statement, not a delivered reading. The second, photoresist is not a single material. The gap between the G-line and I-line chemistries, Chinese producers have made competently for years, and extreme ultraviolet resist is measured in patent portfolios, purification tolerances in parts per trillion, and photospeed characteristics that took the Japanese market leaders years to develop even without the concurrent pressure to deliver on a political schedule. A self-sufficiency number that counts all grades equally flatters the trend. If 40% is reached largely on mature node chemistries while argon fluoride immersion and extreme ultraviolet grades remain overwhelmingly imported or drawn from stockpiles, the headline number overstates the strategic achievement on the nodes that shape competitive manufacturing capability. The third, the 42 firm entity list is not a fixed boundary. That number can expand if controls widen to additional Chinese entities, or if third-country intermediaries currently supplying controlled chemistries face secondary restrictions. The supply gap China is working to substitute against could grow faster than the domestic capacity being built to replace it. The 40% target was calibrated against a specific control perimeter. A widened perimeter changes the denominator of what survival-level self-sufficiency actually requires. The instrument reads a four-fold improvement in domestic share across 2 years and names 3 reasons the instrument could be reading a partial signal. The measurement is a target. The chemistry mix inside the percentage may be tilted toward grades where substitution is less demanding, and the control regime being substituted against is not fixed in scope. The gauge moved from 10% to a targeted 40% in 2 years. That pace does not emerge from normal industrial development. It emerges when the alternative to moving is a stalled production line. Japan's export controls on argon fluoride immersion and extreme ultraviolet resist did not freeze China's photoresist dependency at 10%. They gave the number a deadline. Every liter of domestic resist that qualifies for an advanced node wafer run is, in part, a direct product of the restriction that was intended to prevent that qualification from mattering. 10% then, 40% targeted. 4 times, under embargo. The delta points in one direction, and the restriction that was meant to hold it steady is the mechanism that accelerated it. Walls do not freeze the metric, they schedule it. 10% covered, 90 to protect. 4 times the coverage targeted, 6/10 still exposed, and the embargo that created the deadline is still in effect. The next dated reading, by the end of 2026, does China report domestic photoresist shipments that independently verify the 40% target? And do those shipments include argon fluoride immersion and extreme ultraviolet grades at production yield? Or does the headline number rest on a base of mature node chemistry while the hardest resists remain controlled and scarce? That is the question the 2026 data will answer. If you want the next gauge reading the moment those numbers are reported, subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel follows the number, not the announcement.